Hey y'all, wanted to do a floor ceiling video today. I know I'm supposed to do a leverage video, but it was a little complicated. I don't have the time today to do it. It's probably might even have to be two parts because I don't want to keep these more than like 10 or 15 minutes. I think this is a little too long, but either way, I think this will be helpful to some people. I want to make a note on the analogy I'm going to use is not my analogy. I read this somewhere years ago, and I googled around for like 20 minutes trying to find the original article, and I can't find it. Otherwise, I'd give that person credit and probably just use that page. But if anyone does know where this came from, I can always post it in the notes. But either way, so the analogy is this: there's three horses who have the same exact average finish, and that's important to keep in mind because we're going to eventually bring DFS back into this. But so like the average finish you could think of as a projection, because most projections, if not all of them, are really just what the average amount of points you think this player is going to get on this specific slate. Okay, so the horses all have the exact same average finish. The difference is in their floor and ceiling. So horse one we can call a boom bust horse, where he either finishes first or dead last. The second horse is a steady horse, where they constantly race at a second place speed, let's say, and the third horse is somewhere in between. If the first two horses were to race against each other, and you bet $1 on it, you would expect to win your dollar back. So you would be at a disadvantage, and you would have no advantage. And the reason is, you could probably kind of think about this in your head. Half the time, the boom bust horse is going to have that great ceiling game and win, and the other half, he's going to have his dramatic floor game, and the steady horse will win, right? So you can't win. The difference is now when we bring in a third horse, a third competitor, let's say, the third horse now doesn't change the floor ceiling expectation of horse one, right? The boom bust horse is going to have his ceiling game half the time and his floor game half the time. So yeah, half the time he's going to take dead last, and when you pick him, you're not going to feel too great. But the other half of the time, you're going to scoop the whole pot because his ceiling is higher than either of these other two horses. So 50% of the time he's going to win. The other 50% of the time, those two horses are going to split somehow, right? The steady horse, the horse three, could have his floor game along with the boom bust horse, and then the steady horse would win, or the steady horse or the horse three would have his ceiling game, and then he would win. So either way, they're basically just going to split back and forth the other half of the time. So if you were to bet on those guys, you'd be losing 25 cents for every dollar. And if you bet on the boom bust horse, you're going to make $1.50 for every dollar you're betting. That's a big edge. And again, the important thing to keep in mind is they have the exact same projection, right? They have identical. If you were to compare this to the NBA, it would be like three players who you expect to score 25 points. Just like an optimizer would look at that and go, "Oh, it doesn't matter." Any one of these horses or players would fit. Now, but given the analogy, we know that it does matter. The horse with a higher ceiling will give you an auto profit in that scenario. So to bring this back to DFS, I brought in Awesimo's boom bust rankings today. Just these two players, and I got this a little bit ago, so it might not even be accurate, but it doesn't matter. We just need the numbers. Gordon Hayward, Lonzo Ball today. They have almost identical floor, ceiling, standard deviation, and projection, but they have different boom bust percentages. And this is no secret. If you go on Osmo's page, he explains why. He calculates boom bust in relation to salary. So if Gordon Hayward was 5,200, that boom bust percentage would be almost identical. And so I do want to note quickly that I wouldn't use boom bust when you're trying to apply this analogy, right? You can use boom bust, you might be able to figure out how to make money with it. I'm not saying that. I'm saying in relation to this analogy, it's not going to be very useful for you. What would be useful is the floor, ceiling, and standard deviation. And so let's use a real life example. A boom bust type of player in the NBA would be Mitchell Robinson or someone like that. So Mitchell Robinson, his minutes can vary, especially with he gets in foul trouble, and he gets a lot of peripheral stats like blocks that are infrequent and can raise the volatility of his projection, right? So if you had Mitchell Robinson compared to two other players, who let's say all else being equal, salary, ownership, etc., you can auto profit by taking Mitchell Robinson, assuming he has the higher ceiling. So that is extremely useful. But I think in practice, compared to my last two videos with ownership and correlation, it's not as useful, especially in the NBA. Because the standard deviation of players is oftentimes pretty close, and the floor ceiling comparable players is oftentimes pretty close. But if you did hypothetically have comparable players where the ceiling is like a 3 or 4 point difference, you might be able to get a little edge there by taking the player with the higher ceiling. All else being equal, again, I say that a lot, but it does matter because there's a lot of things going on here, and I think that sums it up. One note I did want to make is I highlighted standard deviation here on purpose because if you're going to make your own standard deviation, you could Google. It's pretty easy to figure out how to make your own standard deviation. If you do make your own standard deviation, you need to be careful with sample sizes because, and maybe even a year isn't enough of a sample size. So if you have a player with a small sample size, he might screw up your whole process. You might have like 2 or 3 players who have a small sample size and their standard deviations off the charts, and it kind of just throws all this stuff out of whack. So just be careful or just use Alex's standard deviation. It's going to be right, or definitely more right than having something with too small a sample size. And it might be this analogy and just this kind of strategy is probably more useful in other sports too. So keep that in mind. But I think that kind of sums up every point I wanted to hit. Let me recap really quick here. Again, the key takeaway here is these horses have the same exact projection, right? So whenever you can, this is another spot where you don't even need to know the sport, and you can get an advantage. And you don't even need to know the sport as long as the projections are identical, all else being equal, and the floor ceiling is different. You could probably bump up your expectation a few cents. And as the games are getting sharper and sharper, you need it. You need it all. So hopefully that's helpful, and I'll try to get a video in tomorrow if I have the time. Have a good one.